Hello my loves and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, there's so much going on, there's so much to talk about at the moment, there's so much going on in horror right now. Not only do you have the independent market just absolutely flourishing, there are so many rising stars in the independent horror market, it's unbelievable. And that's where horror is genuinely flourishing, by the way. If you go to independent markets, that's where you will find the most interesting and experimental stuff, because of course there's often not an onus to make money in the independent markets, not always. And even when there is, the small presses and the independent publishers and the self-publishers, it's not as profound or overweening as it is for the major studios or the major publishers. It's not like, they're not pouring huge amounts of money into these publications, so there's not as much onus to make it back. As a result, what you find, as well as there being a lot of very bad stuff out there, which of course there is, that's the dark side of the coin, unfortunately, that's the flip side of the coin, is that there's a lot of very bad horror out there. There's a lot of very badly written stuff that's being published right now. But then again, that's true, that is and has always been true in the publishing mainstream too. There are many very, very, very big writers who are massive phenomena, who are absolutely terrible on a technical level. I don't mean on a subjective level, as in I don't enjoy what they write. I mean as in they cannot write. The woman who... the best example I can think of, 50 Shades of Grey. 50 Shades of Grey is an objectively bad novel. It's bad erotica. It's terribly written. It's ignorant of its subject matter. It's misogynistic to the nth degree, which is ironic given that it's written by a female writer. It's got this sort of internalized misogyny to it. It misunderstands BDSM culture and misrepresents it. It glorifies what is essentially coercion and rape as as something erotic and desirable, and then associates that with BDSM, which is not what it is at all. It's absolutely awful, and yet it's one of the biggest publishing phenomena in existence. Another one I can think of is Dan Brown. Dan Brown, who wrote The Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons, he's awful. I mean, he is objectively awful. His writing is terrible. When you read, as I've said before on this channel, as I've done a whole series of videos on very, very far back, I did a couple of videos on how much I loathe the Da Vinci Code, and that's because it's one of the few books in all of existence I haven't been able to finish. I usually finish bad books. I usually finish everything I pick up, but the Da Vinci Code is so risible. It's so badly written. You've got characters, the way they're introduced, they're these archetypes. Herbert Langdon comes in and he goes, the book says, eminent cryptologist Herbert Langdon walked into the room. That's the way it introduces character. The way they interpret metaphor is so fucking stupid. It relies upon this myopia, this reduction of the world to the simplest state, to an almost cartoon state, for the plot to work. That's not the way imagery and symbolism works. It doesn't have this absolute meaning. There are myriad contexts in which it could be interpreted that have myriad different interpretations depending upon the biases that the individual audience brings to the image or the object, That's not the way it works. But the way this book promotes symbolism is like it's a roadmap. There are absolute and definite ways of interpreting this image and that image. It's bad writing, ladies and gentlemen. I know that people loved it. I know that it was a huge phenomena, but it's badly written. It's one of those weird phenomena that makes me feel like an alien. It really does, in the same way that 50 Shades of Grey does. I don't understand women in particular, and I know that the vast majority of the audience for 50 Shades of Grey were women. I don't understand women who read that and don't get offended by it, who aren't insulted by it, because it is such a misogynistic fucking book. Same with Twilight. Twilight's a phenomena. Twilight's one of the biggest selling books in all of history, and it sucks. Sorry, I didn't mean that. That was a totally unintentional. I did not mean the pun, and I never mean puns. If it sounds like I'm making a pun, Rowan, I'm not. All right, it's entirely accidental, but it's a terrible series of books on numerous levels. The writing is appalling. There's no rhythm. The characters characters are inconsistent and creepy and weird and not in a good way. You know, there are ways... The thing is about... What I get about Twilight, what really bothers me is what it doesn't explore and what it promotes. I mean, you've got actually, as a central concept, you've got a really interesting tension, yeah? So you've got this 700-year-old guy hanging around high school students and obsessing about one in particular. That tension could potentially be very interesting. It could be very interesting if that were the focus of the whole thing, if the problems of that dynamic, if the creepier elements and the ambiguities of that were the central focus of the story, and it became almost like a psychological study, or like a study of the dynamics of relationships between older and younger partners. This is a great way to do it. This is a brilliant way to do it, but it doesn't do it. It just doesn't. It doesn't bother. It just reduces the characters to these cartoonish archetypes, many of which are massively insulting and stereotyped. I mean, Bella is one of the most passive, annoying, self-interested, entitled characters in all of fiction. She is appalling as a character. She is hideous as a character, and I don't understand. You know, the fact that she's got all of these immortals flocking after her. This 700-year-old guy. Why would a 700-year-old guy be interested in a 16-year-old? I mean, I don't get that. I don't get why a 30-year-old guy or a 20-year-old guy would be interested in a 16-year-old. You know, I don't get it. It doesn't gel with me, you know? It just does not gel with me at all. But it's not explored. It's not the book is not clever enough. It's not insightful enough. It's not ambiguous enough to explore this stuff. And beyond that, on a technical level, it's just poorly conceived and poorly written. Yet it sells gangbusters. It is one of the biggest bits of publishing in existence. It's very interesting to me because there does exist this dynamic of snobbery between big, like, it's enshrined publishing, mainstream publishing, and the independent publishing. And they will say things like, oh, well, anybody can get published at the independent level. That's actually not true. That's actually not true. What you do find on the mainstream level at the moment is, because things like Twilight and because things like 50 Shades of Grey were popular, they're actively looking for this kind of shit now. This kind of shit that is awful on every level, awfully conceived, awfully written, insulting, stereotype, cartoonish, reductionist, but they make money, they make bank, they know they can make them into phenomena because they do pander to the lowest common denominator. There's good erotica out there, there's fantastic erotic fiction. Go and, as we've discussed on this channel in What the Hell Is Wrong With Us? Go and read Exquisite Corpse. Phenomenally erotic. I mean, genuinely beautifully erotic. Go and read Sacrament by Clive Barker. Genuinely beautiful eroticism. There is really good erotic fiction out there, but 50 Shades of Grey ain't it. And just because it has that patina of being enshrined, of being established, of having sold millions, doesn't make it good, alright? It doesn't make it good. Atlas Shrugged, at most of Ayn Rand's work, is terrible. It's terrible on every level. It's poor. The writing is just... I don't understand how anyone can come to this woman and think that she's a good writer. Again, there is this problem, not only with the technical qualities of the prose, the way characters are introduced, the way the plot is moved forward, which is entirely synthetic, but the philosophy she's trying to push relies upon a reduction of reality that is almost cartoonish in order to take seriously. It's laughable. It's actually risible. When I first read Atlas Shrugged, I laughed out loud at it. I laughed out loud at how the woman enshrines privilege and tries to convince you, the reader, that somehow it's just, somehow it's a good thing, somehow it's wonderful, and that the people who are at the top aspired there and deserve it, when we know that's not fucking true. We know that's not fucking true for the most part. If you look at any financial study in this country, the vast majority of wealth is created through interest and is inherited. The vast majority. There are fetuses that are richer than the hardest working, most inspired person on earth because of hereditary, because they're born into the right place and the right time. So this objectionist bullshit, it really hurts. It really hurts. And not only does it hurt, but people take it seriously. If you go on to any of the reviews of Ayn Rand's work, or anyone that tries to take her to task on YouTube, if you look down at the comments section, you will find hundreds of people in support of it, and are not just teenagers. Teenagers and adolescents, I can kind of understand. I can see how you could be hoodwinked by her. But adults that take her seriously, I don't know how you do it. The only way you can do it is by, in your own head, reducing reality, ignoring the myriad complexities of history, of tradition, of culture, of influence. You need to ignore all of that. You need to shut it off. You need to be ignorant of the circumstances which determine individual status on a prescribed level, on a societally prescribed level. It's appalling to me that people take her seriously, but she is massively significant. She's massively significant. She's one of the biggest selling writers in all of history and one of the most significant, so take that for what it is, you know? Popularity is no guarantor of quality. It's no guarantor of intelligence. It's no guarantor of technical capability. It's no guarantor of richness or of depth or of philosophical resonance. It just isn't. There are works being published right now in the independent market that are self-published, that are absolutely stunning. They are really beautiful. And yet they are disregarded on the basis that they're not being published by a mainstream publisher. And that's a real problem. That's a real problem for me, especially when we know from experience, from what we've seen, from everybody knows this, that the mainstream is responsible for shite, for peddling shite for the most part. You know, celebrity-written books, celebrities of any kind, like comedians and people who are on television, they don't even have to write anything at all. They get things ghost-written that are then published by big mainstream publishers because they sell on the basis of the name themselves. Joe Pasquale, I mean, like a Z-list celebrity if ever there was one. But Joe Pasquale published a collection of horror short stories a few years back, and I was all ready to give it a shake. I thought, wow, maybe, you know, this guy who no one would ever have pegged as being into horror, maybe he'll come out and he'll be like one of the best horror writers ever. No. That book was published entirely on the basis of his, you know, somewhat dubious name. I mean, Z-list hardly covers it. And it is one of the worst bits of work I have ever read. It is so badly written on a technical level. It is like a child wrote it, you know? I remember when I was a kid at school writing stuff for English class that was better than the shit that's in this book. But it will sell. It will sell because it's his name. People will see it on bookshelves and go, Joe Pasquale, he wrote a collection of horror stories. Isn't that interesting? And they'll buy it. They'll buy it. Some people will even convince themselves it's good. Some people will even convince themselves that it's good on the basis that the person they like wrote it. But I will say this, because of the way it's going at the moment, the entire onus in horror is shifting over to the independent market, to the small markets. The big publishers are just hemorrhaging money and support because they're publishing crap. They are consistently going back to people who were big in the 1980s, in the 1990s, people who were huge, people like, say, Stephen King actually is not a good example because he's been pretty consistent. He still publishes good work by and large, but people like, as much as it hurts me to say it, people like Clive Barker, who hasn't published anything good for a long time, and they are publishing crap like The Scarlet Gospels, which is no good at all and should never have got past the editing stage. Whoever looked at that, I think it was Galanx who published it. I can't quite remember. I'll correct that if I find out who. But the big mainstream publisher that published The Scarlet Gospels, that big, expensive hardback, should have looked at that script and said, no, take it away, polish it, refine it a little bit and bring it back. Because I'm telling you now, I do a little bit of editing for small presses, and I can tell you now, if that came to me, I would have sent it back. I'd have sent it back with a lot of notes saying, this is incoherent, this doesn't work, this is badly written, there is a grammatical error here, this seems to skip from this point to this point. They rely on the name. They rely upon the enshrinement of the name. There are certain canonized figures in horror. There are gatekeepers to the horror genre, and sadly a lot of them, they are in the waning now. Their stars are definitely in the waning. They've said what they've got to say. The vast majority of their good work is beyond them now. And there are new people, but they're flourishing in strange markets, in a very strange place and time. They are flourishing in the independent arena, and it's hard. It's really bloody hard. I'm trying to do it, and it's very fucking hard. I mean, I believe in my work very, very strongly. I think it's good. I think it's unusual. I honestly don't think there's anything like it out there. And that's actually a barrier for me, because what I found is that it is difficult to get. It is, despite the fact that the independent markets are way more open, it is difficult to accrue an audience when you don't have a specific genre, when you don't have a specific audience to target. It's very, very, very hard. And my stuff doesn't really. It's kind of all over the place. Sometimes it kind of verges on the splatterpunk. Sometimes it's more Barkerian, it's philosophical, it's metaphysical. Sometimes it's slightly science fiction. It's kind of all over the place. It's abstract. That's the best way I can describe it. It's abstract. Somebody once described it as literary horror, which I think is a stupid term. It's kind of flattering in its way, because literary kind of has this, the prefix literary is kind of taken on this strange meaning. I don't understand why it exists, because to me all horror is literary, all fiction is literary. I don't understand why it exists, but what it generally means when it's used in its colloquial sense is that it is of literary tradition. It's aspiring, it's clever horror. It's horror that's trying to break boundaries, that's trying to move outside of particular subgenres, that's trying to engage the reader on an intellectual and philosophical level, it seems to me. But I don't understand why that exists, because that's true of almost any fiction. It's an odd one, but my stuff, when it has been reviewed, has often been described as literary, and that's fine, but I don't want that to stick, because I don't want it to appeal to a limited market. That is another one of the dark sides of what's happening with the liberation of horror. Actually, what I've noticed is happening is you're getting this factionalism. So now, because there is such a broad market, because there are so many people publishing, because there are so many voices out there, you are getting these subdivisions of horror that are crystallizing. So you're getting your body horror, you're getting your zombie apocalypse horror, you're getting your post-apocalyptic horror, you're getting science fiction horror, you're getting your gothic horror, your Lovecraftian horror, your vampire romance, your erotic horror, you're getting your bizarro fiction, you're getting a lot of weird and wacky stuff out there, quite frankly. And what that means is that audiences can treat it like a supermarket. It means that they can go to Amazon and they can type in splatterpunk, they can type in literary horror, and they can find writers who will probably appeal to their taste. And that's both a good and a bad thing. It's a good and a bad thing in the sense that because they can search for exactly what they want, it means that they're not broadening. It means that they're not reading. Like, when you get a collection that's just labelled as horror, then you don't know what the stories are going to consist of. They can be anything. They can be loads of stuff. And that broadens your horizons. That actually broadens your horizons. Because it means that you're not reading the same kind of thing with the same themes, the same subjects, the same imagery over and over and over and over. What it means is that you are broadening. It means that you might encounter a kind of horror that you've never encountered before. It means you may encounter a new writer that you've never encountered before, but who you love. That's happened to me a lot, actually. That happened to me with Christina Faust. It happened to me with Laura Marrow. It happened to me with Poppy Z. Bright, aka Billy Martin, originally. It happened with a lot of writers I now really like. Neil Gaiman was one of those. The first Neil Gaiman story I read was actually a short story in a collection years and years and years back. It happened to me with Lovecraft. I kind of discovered Lovecraft that way too. It's fascinating that it's a fascinating phenomenon, but because people can just go and read whatever they want, they can just select the kind of fiction they like, the result is that maybe they may not broaden out naturally as they would if they were just reading a collection of short stories without any particular subgenre or theme or whatever. And that's slightly problematic. That is a slightly problematic thing, because it means you get this reduction in the mind of the reader. You get this myopia happening, whereby any story that maybe stretches outside the bounds that they're used to is treated with disdain. It's actually rejected. And I've actually found that with a couple of my short stories. I released one not too long ago, which really divided the crowd. It's one from Born in Blood, Volume 1. It's actually the concluding story, which is called Only Angels Know. And Only Angels Know, I was really pleased with the reaction to it, because it was released in a splatterpunk collection, Fighting Back, which you can purchase on Amazon. It was released on that originally and is now available in Born in Blood Volume 1. And it's the people who got it and really responded well to it and were really complimentary. The people who didn't get it fucking hated it. And I've got to say, I read the reviews of the ones that fucking hated it, and I was like, yeah, this is brilliant. I was actually really, 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 really pleased, because the complaints they were expressing was exactly the reaction I was hoping to provoke with the story. And it is that I like that. I like that when writers do it. I I like it when writers that I read do it, when they deliberately alienate audiences, when they don't pander to every demographic available, because I do think that results in weak fiction. I believe that results in pandering, watered down and diluted work. I like work that is very specific and particular. But relating to the market, it's one of the double-edged swords of the liberation of fiction that has come about as a result of the efflorescence of the independent market. But it's fascinating to me. Now what you've got is this flourishing sort of playground of horror and of genre fiction in general. It's not just horror, it's fantasy, it's science fiction, and it's those places, it's what would be called speculative fiction collectively, I suppose, if you were trying to put it onto a bookshelf in a bookstore or a library. It's that kind of fiction which doesn't really have a genre but which is redolent of particular genres. It's flourishing in the independent markets and it's dying on its ass in the mainstream. It's really interesting. It's really fascinating. But because it is flourishing in independent circles, we are starting to get, in mainstream cinema of all places, we are starting to finally get this slow bleed through, this creeping efflorescence of smart cinema. Again, smart horror cinema. We're getting stuff like Hereditary, which is not perfect, but which is bloody clever. We're getting stuff like in television, TV series, we're getting things like The Haunting of Hill House. We're getting The Witch. We're getting Jordan Peele's stuff, which, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with its politics or not, is clever horror. At least it's trying to do something. At least it's trying to say something. Now, what it's trying to say and what it's trying to do is ambiguous. I mean, whether you respond to it or not is kind of up in the air. But it is trying to say something. It is beyond the stuff that the mainstream has become used to, which is just endless remakes, of reboots, of reimaginings, of sequel-laden franchises, of slasher films and whatnot. We're getting there. There is stuff that is happening, and it's a good thing. Things like The Ritual, it's things like Annihilation. We're starting to see, again, this slow efflorescence of smart horror. The Babadook is a really good example. The Babadook is absolutely stunning. And it's happening because new voices are starting to emerge, not because old voices are re-emerging, which so often doesn't work. It so often doesn't work. Just look at Thomas Harris, if you want an example. His latest book is trash. It's absolute trash. It's because there are new voices, and there is space. There is a market. There is space for them to effloresce, which is nothing short of wonderful. Nothing short of wonderful. So, I think we'll continue this discussion next time, ladies and gents, because it's an interesting one and there's lots to talk about. So, until then, bye-bye!